Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 50. John Major. The In-Betweener. John Major was Prime Minister between 1990 and 1997. Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. We're looking at a relatively recent Prime Minister this week, but before we move on, please just a reminder, do give this episode a like and don't forget to subscribe if you're not already subscribed to Long History and its Random UK Prime Minister of the Week series. Okay, let's get going with an episode we've subtitled The In-Betweener. John Major's time as Prime Minister was sandwiched between Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair's premierships, and that's why we've given this episode the subtitle of In-Betweener. Thatcher and Blair have both gained an ism, and although Thatcherism is a much more commonly used term than Blairism, it is pretty certain that Majorism as a term hasn't emerged at all. Yet, as we'll see, Major's version of politics was just as easily definable as Thatcher's, albeit in a totally different way. What was John Major like? Margaret Thatcher was so easy to parody that she was a gift to comedians and impressionists. When Major came along, therefore, there was something of a collective pause for breath as these same comedians realised that a golden age of satire had just ended. How could Major possibly compete with Thatcher in the satire stakes? When compared to Thatcher, Major seemed, well, dull, and this is what the satirists latched onto, particularly portraying him as a grey puppet in the popular series Spitting Image. He chased peas around a plate, having mundane conversations with his wife, in complete contrast to the almost demonic figure of Thatcher in the same series. The curious contradiction about this supposed dullness, however, is that it is, well, nearly as memorable as the famed show's portrayal of Thatcher, implying in a way that he couldn't have been so dull after all. Major at the time he was in power was treated as something of a hanger-on, as a vestige of the previous regime, as a joke, and as a weak Prime Minister, particularly when contrasted with Thatcher. His longevity in office, however, and the achievements that we'll go on to later, have meant that his reputation has been reappraised more recently, as we'll see in this episode. John Major married Norma Johnson in Brixton in 1970. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. What was the historical background? The 80s had been synonymous with Margaret Thatcher, but the 90s are not synonymous with John Major. When he entered office, the First Gulf War was raging, and he would see it to its end on the 28th of February 1991. The Berlin Wall fell at the end of the 1980s, and the fallout from that event took place during much of Major's tenure. Many Eastern European countries from Slovakia to Estonia gained their independence during these years. It was the time when the Iron Curtain completely disappeared, opening up other Eastern Bloc countries to the West for the first time in decades. In retrospect, it seems like a particularly peaceful and optimistic time for many, with many people gaining newfound freedoms. However, the end of the Cold War also came with new wars, not least with the breakup of Yugoslavia. This was the era when the term Generation X became popular, not least thanks to the publication of Douglas Coupland's book Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. And the 1990s also came with the first uptake of computers on a massive scale, with them beginning to become indispensable in every home and office, just as the internet age was beginning. Over in the US at the time, the first George Bush and then Bill Clinton were presidents during John Major's time in office. Who could vote? We ask this question in every episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week to trace the evolution of democracy in the country, and this was a curious time for the UK's democracy. With the Prime Ministers either side of him lasting over 10 years in the job, Major's 6 years and 156 days as Premier has been seen as something of an afterthought for many years. The gap between 2 much more significant premiers. Yet, times have changed since those years of prime ministerial stability. Of the 6 Prime Ministers since Major's successor, Tony Blair, only David Cameron has come anywhere near close to achieving Major's time in office, and even he fell short by 2 or 3 months. The tenure of the other 5 Prime Ministers did not last even half as long as Major, making him look, in retrospect, as something of a survivor and, pun intended, something of a major force in post-Thatcher politics. Indeed, of 19 premiers in the 20th century, his tenure amounted to the 4th longest single span of time in the job. Only Herbert Asquith and Harold Macmillan join in Thatcher and Blair with a longer single span. It's true, though, that with Major, the superlatives aren't so easy to find. Another 4 Prime Ministers, for example, had longer terms in office over multiple tenures in the 20th century, including Winston Churchill and Harold Wilson. When we ask the question who could vote, it's a pertinent question due to one of Major's lesser-known records. He is the Prime Minister to have won a general election with the biggest quantity of votes ever, adding up to just over 14 million votes, and for comparison, Keir Starmer won his 2024 election with 9.5 million votes. And it's true that after Thatcher's downfall, many, if not most, predicted that Major would stop being Prime Minister as soon as a general election was held. Compared to Thatcher, he seemed, as the satirists portrayed him, weak and boring. That election was held on the 9th of April 1992, and it turned out to be one of the most unpredictable elections, at least since the Second World War. Few people seriously expected Major to win. The Conservative government wasn't popular after 13 years in power, and yet the Labour alternative, it proved, was also not particularly popular. And if the turnout was anything to go by, the stakes seemed high. 11.5 million voted for Labour. In 2024 that would have been by far a winning number, but a lot more voted for the Conservatives. It showed Labour that they'd have to work much harder to gain a majority. And the Conservative Party's punt on having a new leader, who contrasted totally with his predecessor, worked. What was John Major's background? John Major's father was 63 when the future Prime Minister was born. He was the youngest of his siblings, and his father had been a music hall performer, a kind of an all-rounder, a comedian and a singer and dancer. But he'd given that up well before John Major was born on the 29th of March 1943. John Major was born in Surrey, southern England, and when he was born, his father was running a gardening ornaments business. At the age of 11, John Major passed the exams of the time to go to a grammar school. His father's health grew worse at that time, and Major left school at 15 with 3 O-levels. As such, Major is one of the few Prime Ministers not to go to university, and even within that group he's in a small set of Prime Ministers who didn't go because they were essentially working class, or at least not aristocrats. Some of the richer Prime Ministers in this group of premiers who haven't been to university, most notably Winston Churchill, avoided university because their wealthiness meant that a university education was a nice to have, shall we say. It certainly wasn't mandatory. When Major left school, he worked for an insurance company for a time and also went into his father's ornaments business for a time. He worked for the London Electricity Board and then went on to work in a range of jobs in banks. He joined the Conservatives at an early age in 1959 and stood as a councillor for them in the 1964 general election at the age of 21. He lost that one, but he kept trying until 1968, when he won a position as a councillor in the London borough of Lambeth, which he would proceed to go on and lose in 1971. He stayed with the party, however, and by 1974 he was on track to become an MP, eventually winning the seat of Huntingdonshire in 1979. How did John Major become Prime Minister? As Margaret Thatcher came to the end of her 11 years as Prime Minister, she seemed to become increasingly detached from reality. Her demeanour was increasingly imperious, and, over the years, it had become increasingly difficult to disagree with her at all on anything. The apotheosis of this imperiousness came when Thatcher pushed through a new tax, the so-called poll tax, to fund local government. This was a flat fee that each taxpayer paid regardless of their wealth. This tax was widely and wildly seen as unfair, yet Thatcher pushed it through anyway, in the full knowledge that she was right. John Major, in the meantime, had been promoted to the cabinet after the 1987 general election, when he became Chief Secretary to the Treasury. The fact that he came to prominence 8 years into Thatcher's tenure as Prime Minister worked very much to his advantage. He was promoted to Foreign Secretary in July 1989, and then, when Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, resigned, Major was chosen to replace him. This post has often historically been seen as a stepping stone to becoming Prime Minister, and it was clear that Major was one of Thatcher's favourites at this moment in time. His steadiness and his apparent mildness worked in his favour, not least as other men fell by the wayside by clashing or disagreeing with the ever-increasingly imperious Thatcher. Thatcher's end came as something of a surprise to everyone. Previously unpopular policies had been pushed through, but this poll tax proved to be very controversial. Thatcher was increasingly imperious, but also increasingly isolated, having made enemies and lost friends during those 10 years. It was Michael Heseltine who came forward to run against Thatcher for the leadership of the party and hence for the role of Prime Minister. However, it's often the case that the person who has the initial stab of the knife loses in the initial round of the battle. There was a vote, which Thatcher won against Heseltine, but her numbers were too low, so a second round of voting had to be held. Thatcher, at this moment, was persuaded by her colleagues not to stand in the second round. She chose to back John Major, who had shrewdly managed to stay in the background during most of these events. He eventually gained an overall majority, his victory being convincing enough for the other two candidates to withdraw. Heseltine's gamble had failed, Thatcher was out of office, and Major became Prime Minister. What were John Major's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? His tenure was very mixed. At the time, it seemed like a series of missteps, of near disasters and actual disasters, as Major headed a cabinet of people tearing each other apart. Yet, as he was in power for this relatively long time, looking back we can see that he did have some notable achievements. He cancelled that poll tax which had led to Margaret Thatcher's downfall, replacing it with a council tax. Northern Ireland had been a constant issue during the 1970s and 1980s, and Major at least managed to make some progress on the issue to move it forward. He was the Prime Minister in charge when new relationships were established in the post-Cold War world. During his tenure, many polytechnics were turned into universities, and the role of the NHS was changed so that the public was seen as having the right to good service, and were not seen as lucky recipients of what was granted to them. One of Major's most significant legacies in the meantime was the National Lottery, a new form of voluntary taxation for the UK, which has, for example, provided funds which have contributed to the country's Olympic success further down the line. Why did John Major stop being Prime Minister? Well, we've just listed all his achievements, so it's tempting to assume that Major ranked as one of the most beloved and well-respected Prime Ministers by the time he left office. However, the opposite is true. Major's majority after that risky 1992 election was 21. Now that's pretty sizable, but not overwhelming. His victory caught everyone by surprise, but was also a bit unconvincing. Was it really just another Thatcher victory in disguise? The most consequential event of Major's tenure in the meantime happened on the 16th of September 1992, on what has come to be known as Black Wednesday. This was when the UK's currency was forced out of a European exchange rate mechanism, which was a precursor to full adoption of a single European currency. For a few moments it seemed that the country's economy was in chaos, and it wasn't just that the UK lost face with this act. Really, the Conservative Party's whole reputation and the reason it had won that 1992 election rested on its reputation to maintain a steady economy. With Black Wednesday, that reputation was shattered, and Major, still seen only as Thatcher's not-so-forceful replacement, never quite recovered. even though the country was recovering economically by the end of Major's tenure. In May 1994, in the meantime, Tony Blair took control of the Labour Party. One of Major's achievements, it could be said, was that by winning that 1992 election, he moved the centre of politics definitively in the direction of 1980s Thatcherism. If Thatcher ended the post-war consensus, Major put the final nail in the coffin. Major's victory forced the Labour Party to realise, arguably at least, that it needed to speak the same language as the Conservatives in order to win the trust of the British public, particularly if it wanted to gain that reputation for economic credibility that Major had lost. Labour was on the rise, but the Conservatives didn't go out without a fight. Unfortunately, however, their fight was with each other, with Major even resigning his leadership at one point in order to hold a leadership contest. He won that contest, so the gamble didn't backfire, but it still wasn't enough to convince the public that he was in control. Plagued with infighting and scandal, Major lost the general election of the 1st of May 1997, handing Tony Blair's Labour Party a majority of 179 seats. Why should we remember John Major? Well, it's quite a fascinating and mixed legacy for such a supposedly uninteresting man. From a father with a music hall background to the largest ever vote in a general election, John Major proves that relative normality doesn't completely exclude someone from being Prime Minister. Now, it does help to be posh if you want to be Prime Minister, and it doesn't necessarily go against you if you have a striking personality. But sometimes someone relatively normal can take the top job. It might be a slightly arguable point, but he does seem to have been the most working-class Conservative Prime Minister there's ever been. Thatcherism is much written about, but John Major's version of politics is also quite easy to define, actually. His is a slightly old-fashioned, more modest version of conservatism, involving politeness, tradition, mixed with an ability to bend with the breeze if necessary. Now, if he'd been an aristocrat, he would have been typical of an 18th or 19th century Prime Minister. But he does, hopefully, say something about the country that Major, from a relatively normal background, led a party which is generally of the upper crust into power. We haven't mentioned that Major is a big fan of cricket. He's written books about the sport. And there is a sense that unlike Thatcher, he liked to work that way as part of a team as Prime Minister. Unfortunately, however, after 11 years of Thatcherism, the team he inherited was too used to that imperious brand of leadership. Nevertheless, Major kept the team in office for much longer than most people expected, and much longer than most other 20th century Prime Ministers. Thank you for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. I hope that was of interest. It's just a starting point. About John Major's convoluted time in office, there was lots going on, so please forgive any mistakes and just see this as a starting point so you can do your own research. Thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to like before you move on. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 50, John Major, the in-betweener. Goodbye.